Today is very important because the Holocaust happened so many, many years ago. And what is it that we gained from the memories of these terrible disasters that happened, this death of so many millions of people? So if it was really a terrible catastrophe, generally what we want to do is we want to forget these kind of things. We want to repress them and just skip it, move on with life. But that's not what we want to do with the Holocaust. What we want to do with the Holocaust is we want to make meaning out of it. What is the meaning of what happened and how does it affect our lives today? And how does it affect our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives? So when you called me and you said to me, Dr. Faye, can you come on and talk about your experience of the Holocaust? You could have called me at 2 a.m. in the morning and I would have made myself available because it is so important to tell our story. So here's our story. My mother is one of 8, and I'm so proud to have my brother on here, Dr. Jacob Brand, and my older brother. So of course, as we know, older brothers are
much older.
Older brothers are always ready to correct you if you're making mistakes. So older brother, Dr. Rand, if I'm saying anything that is incorrect or that needs more examination, please join in because this is the story of this is our Holocaust story. This is what we lived through as Holocaust children survivors. So our story begins with my mother. My mother is one of 8 children, 6 sisters and 2 brothers, 8 children, 6 girls, 2 boys, a mother, a father, living happily in Hungary, a wonderful life. They lived with their grandparents, the way we live now, some of us, that we're lucky enough to be close to our parents. They lived in a little city called Bomozuvaros, near the town of Debrecen, near Budapest. And they shared Friday nights together. They shared weddings together, bar mitzvahs together. They were a very happy family, always singing and very, very, very happy. And sure enough, in the 1940, Dr. Rand, Yankel, what year exactly did they put them into the ghetto? Do you know what year it was?
That would probably be 1944, because the reason is that Hungary, for those of you who aren't aware, during the earlier part, well, during the Second World War, was run by a fascist government, an Admiral Horthy, who was also anti-Semitic, but he wasn't murderously. He was horribly, abusively anti-Semitic and killing also, but nothing like the extermination. And because it was run by a fascist government, Hitler was saving on his own resources by not putting his own soldiers and SS into Hungary, until Admiral Horthy started to see that the war was going definitely in the other direction and diminished his loyalty to Hitler, at which time the Germans invaded Hungary and took over the administration. So that's why the Hungarian Jews, compared to the Polish Jews, were relatively spared because they were not, the beginning of the exterminations didn't occur until 1944. Sorry, Faye.
Yeah. So then this family, this beautiful family of 8 children and a mother and a father, they were taken out of their home in their little house that they lived in, and they were put inside a ghetto with very terrible living conditions. My mother tells the story of that she was in regular school, she was in a public school, and a lot of the children were Jewish, a lot of the children were not Jewish. So her best friends were not Jewish. And my mother would stand by the gate of the ghetto watching her friends continue going to school. And she would call out to them and she would say from behind the gate where she was locked inside the ghetto, she would say, Maria, why aren't you saying hello to me? We went to school together last week. Why aren't you saying hello to me? And Maria ignored her. Her best friends, they ignored her. And my mother was just so sad. She will never forget that feeling of having her friends walk by. They continued going to school and she was left over there in the ghetto. And it's the beginning of their sad story. From the ghetto, they were taken to the cattle cars. Again, the whole family together. They were taken to the cattle cars. And in the cattle cars, they were left standing for days without food, without a bathroom, without anything, without anything. Many people died in the cattle cars. The family, again, amazingly stayed intact. The grandfather, the grandmother, and the children. One day, one of my mother's cousins was fainting and screaming out, I'm going to die. I can't do this anymore. I need water, but there was no water to be had. And my grandfather, he said, I have water. And everybody looked, how do you have water? He was a very religious man. So what he did is when they left to go to the cattle cars, he took a little cup with him. And when it would rain through the window, he would leave his little cup outside the window so that what? Unbelievable, not for him to drink, so that in the morning, this religious man could wash his hands with the water and be able to say the morning blessing. Unbelievable. But now here's this lady who's dying, right? So what does the Torah tell us? It tells us that a life is more important than the practice, and that it's more important to save a life. So forget about that he needed this for saying the prayer. He said, here, take this water. You need the water. Take it. And he gave her the water. From there, this family went together. They were transported to Vienna. In Vienna, they were put into a school building. No beds, no dormitory, terrible, terrible conditions, and they were put to work. They were a family of 8. The children were young. My mother was about 15 years old, and she was put to work on putting cables down for the trains to go. And my mother would say later, in later years, I did such a bad job of putting those cables down that I'm sure that everybody that went on those cable trains, don't worry, I killed them all. So she always had a way of looking at things from a very positive perspective. She would not sit and cry about it. She would say, you know what? I passed by a window, a lady, a German Nazi lady, believe it or not, would put a basket of food outside her window. My mother would take the basket and bring it back to the school children, back to the school for members of her family to have the food. It wasn't good food, but at least it was something that she came back with. This brings us to the story that we're going to tell in a few minutes about, were all the Nazis horrible people? Let's talk about it. Because from that place, from the Vienna school building, they were marched off to travel up into the Mauthausen concentration camp. That was a terrible story because the family was together. That was wonderful. One of the children, the oldest daughter, had gotten married, and there was a granddaughter. My grandfather did not want anybody to know this was a granddaughter because they would have killed her. So he said, no, that's not my granddaughter. She's my child. And he carried her on his shoulders as they marched up to the Mauthausen concentration camp. Now, for anybody who's been to Mauthausen in Vienna, it is the most beautiful, bucolic, stunning place. The grass is green. The flowers have beautiful colors. It is absolutely a beautiful place. Now imagine all these Jews, starving Jews, no shoes. My mother's leg was amputated in later years. And she says she knows that her leg was amputated because she walked in the snow with no shoes. Now here are these Jews walking up to Mauthausen, and not more than 15 feet away from them, maybe even 10 feet away from them, were coffee shops, beautiful coffee shops, where the Nazis were sitting there, having their coffee, smoking their cigarette. And just like Maria, that little girl who walked right past my mother and didn't say hello to her and went to school, that was how these Nazis sat over there and watched the Jews walk up the mountain. No shoes. They were being killed by the Nazis as they were going up the mountain. But no, these Nazis, they continued to smoke their cigarettes and have their coffee while at arm's length away, these Jews were being killed. And that was where my mother's family was. They walked up the hill to Mauthausen. They walked and walked for 3 weeks. They walked up the hill to Mauthausen. They came to Mauthausen. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible place. It was a death camp. They came there at a later point in time. They were very, very fortunate. They survived. They survived again, a miracle. This family survived the Mauthausen concentration camp. After the Mauthausen concentration camp, after they were liberated, my grandfather got typhus. And at that point in time, he was taken away into a hospital. He died at the hospital. The family, it was 2 weeks after liberation, they weren't in any kind of shape to be able to figure out what to do. The hospital buried him. Years later, the family was able to find where he was buried. How did we find where he was buried? Because they had a template of his teeth. They had a thing where his teeth were recorded, and they were able to find him. He was buried in the Mauthausen concentration camp. And year after year, we go back. There is a memorial for him that was put up after the war. On his memorial, it says his name. It says Tibor Stamler in English and in Hebrew. And my grandfather's burial is right there in the Mauthausen concentration camp. So in order for us to visit my grandfather's grave over the years, many times, we go back to the Mauthausen concentration camp with my mother. It's very sad. We tried a number of times to move the grave away from Mauthausen so that we wouldn't have to go to this horrible place where bodies were thrown over the cliff, where so many Jews were killed. Why would we want to go back there? But we've never succeeded in being able to move his body away. Well, about 2 years ago, Rabbi Katzin calls me, and Rage, as we all know, what's Rage known for? It's known for the young Russian American Jews that come in to learn a little bit about what it means to be a Jew, to learn a little bit about their ancestry. And part of what draws them to Rage is what? They get to travel to Israel. And that's so much fun. I can't wait to start traveling to Israel again with Rage. But on our way to Israel, Rabbi Katzin always allows us to go to another country. So Rabbi Katzin called me and said, we're going to Israel again. Are you coming? And of course, I'll never say no. Yeah, of course I'm coming. Well, this year, we're thinking about going to Vienna. So I said, okay, great. But Rabbi Katzin, if I go to Vienna, I have to go to the Mauthausen concentration camp. I can't stop in Vienna and not go to my grandfather. So Rabbi Katzin says, great, we'll all go to the Mauthausen concentration camp. I said, Rabbi Katzin, how many of there are us? He said, there's about 60 or 70 of us. I said, we're all going to my grandfather's grave in Mauthausen? He said, Dr. Fay, you're taking us all to the Mauthausen concentration camp. So sure enough, all of us boarded the buses and we arrive. We go up that hill, but we're going up in buses. But that hill, all the students, the Rage students, they're looking and they're thinking, we're going to a concentration camp. There can't be a concentration camp here. This is like the most gorgeous place we've ever seen. This trip up the mountain, this is stunning. And they're all taking pictures. And they're saying there can't be a concentration camp here.
Faye, I can even interrupt just for a second if you'll let me. For those of you who've seen the movie The Sound of Music, about, of course, the Von Trapp family in Austria. Well, the concentration camp is in the same area of Austria where the hills are alive with the sound of music. Just absolutely beautiful scene.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. So as we're going up, they're saying, there can't be a concentration camp here. And they're all taking pictures. And I'm thinking, just wait, just wait. And sure enough, we get up to the top of the hill, and there is that horrible, horrible Mauthausen concentration camp. Horrible, horrible building. It's horrible. And we open up the bus doors open, and there's a man standing outside of the bus doors, and he says, so are you ready for your tour? And everybody gets off the bus. And I say to the man, are you our travel guide? And he said, yeah. I said, so what's your name? He said, Daniel. I said, Daniel, let me ask you a question. We have a lot of people here. I don't want to drag them all over, but my grandfather, he's buried here in the concentration camp. Do you mind leaving me 10 minutes at the end for me to go over and just say hello to my grandfather? He said, your grandfather is buried here? I said, yeah. He said, your grandfather is Tibor Stamler? And I'm like shocked. I actually, as I tell the story now, I get goosebumps again. I say, how do you know my grandfather? How did you know the name, Tibor Stamler? He said, your grandfather is the only grave that we have here with a name on it. So of course I know Tibor Stamler. We all know Tibor Stamler. We know when he was born. We know when he died. So I'm like, it's unbelievable to me. And all the students, we go around the concentration camp. We look at the atrocities. We go by the crematorium. There was a crematorium there, terrible, still there. We go by the dental chair where they pulled out the teeth of the terrible Holocaust victims. We go by the gas chamber, the showers where they put them in and they showered them down before they gassed them. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And of course, all the students are so sad. And then he says, Daniel, are you ready to go to your grandfather's grave? And of course, we're all ready. So all of us go to the grave, all 60 students. Can you imagine? 60, 70 students are standing by my grandfather's grave. And at that moment, I said to myself, Zaidi, this is the reason that you are buried here. You're buried here, you died here, you survived the war, you made it through to be buried here so that these 70 children could come here and cry and feel connected to their Judaism and feel connected to the idea that all of these people, they died as Jews. They didn't give up. They died as Jews. They kept on going as Jews. They could have given up. They could have hidden. They could have said, no, we're not Jews, we're Christians. But they didn't. So there they are, all of them praying. I'm crying. They're crying. We're all crying. We step outside of the cemetery, and one of the students says to Daniel, so Daniel, who are you? Why are you here? Why do you work in this horrible place? And Daniel says, I've been working here a very long time. And they say, how old are you? He says, I'm 37 years old. And they say, and when did you start working here? He says, I started working here when I was 17 years old. He's been working there for 20 years. And the students say to Daniel, why would you torture yourself, Daniel? Why would you live here? Why would you work here? You're here. Why would you do this? And Daniel says, I'm here because my grandparents, my family lives in Mauthausen. My family is one of the families that was sitting there having coffee, smoking their cigarettes, watching the Jews go up to Mauthausen. And in our high school graduating class, they had said to us, you know, you have to do community work. And they gave us choices. You could work in a hospital, you could work with little children. I requested that my community work be in the Mauthausen concentration camp. I wanted to be here. I wanted to give back. I want to be here to tell the story that there really were Nazis living here. It's real. My grandfather was one of those Nazis. Now, how amazing is that story? That the grandchild of a Nazi person is there together with me. We're there together, all crying together, arm in arm. We're there together. And I said to Daniel, I said, Daniel, I have to try to move my grandfather away from here. He doesn't belong here. He belongs in Israel. He belongs away from this terrible place. And Daniel started crying. He said, please don't move your grandfather. I'm begging. He was crying. Don't move your grandfather, because he is our only symbol to show that there were Jews here. All the other graves are mass graves of the Jews. His is the only grave that has a name on it. We know Tibor Stamler. We are connected to Tibor Stamler. We need him to stay here. And that's our story. That's our story of Mauthausen, the concentration camp, Tibor Stamler, my grandfather, and my family. And that's my story. And I'm so honored that my brother is here because he has so much more information than I do.
They told the story really beautifully, and it brought back just so many memories. And I'm grateful to Faye for having organized this just wonderful brief trip. What was it, Faye? Just 3 days, 2 days, 3 days? But there was a lifetime buried into it. And just want to also add that as we were going from the Vienna airport directly to Mauthausen, which, the signs are to Linz in Western Austria, the driver was saying, it's so many and so many, right? 100 kilometers or whatever. And I said to my mom, who was sitting in the front seat next to the driver, I said, oh, Mom, as we're going along, do you remember any of this? She said, Yankala, I walked this. And also remarkable was passing by the cafes that my sister was, Dr. Faye was referring to. So we come to the gates of Mauthausen. And one of the things that I was struck by before we even entered was that there's a rectangular structure, if I remember, outside of, just in contiguity, outside of Mauthausen. And it turns out that that was a reservoir or swimming pool for the Nazis to be able to, right, Faye, to relax.
Yeah, believe it or not, outside the Mauthausen, right outside the concentration camp, there is a beautiful swimming pool. Swimming pool. And there, these Nazis, these animals had the chutzpah to be swimming in a swimming pool while the Jews were being killed 20 feet inside the gate. They were swimming. These are, how do we even refer to them as human beings? How do we call them? They're not.
So we came up to after the car park. We came up to the front gates, and we entered. And there, by coincidence, soon after entering, we also met a docent who was working there. And soon after we entered, there was a group of Austrian high school students, and they were probably about 16 years old, because a part of the Austrian education program, as in Germany, is Holocaust education. And this was the school trip to learn about the Holocaust. So there's a class of these kids, and there's my mother. And my mother is very gregarious. She's been in decline in recent times, but she's very gregarious. And a conversation began between my mother and the teacher of these students. And my mother was like very proud. Oh, I was here, as the teacher is trying to teach them about Mauthausen. And so it turned out my mother was there when she was 16 as a slave, destined for execution and murder. And there's the teacher who's there with her students, and they engaged in a conversation. And it was so interesting to me. Questions arose, like students, are you bitter or angry at us? And my mother said, no, not at all, not at all. wasn't you. Uh, how do you feel about what happened? And my mother came out with, uh, I love everybody, you know. She said among the liberation soldiers was a brigade or what, of African American soldiers in World War II. African Americans, blacks were now, you know, people of color were segregated into different units, and they were part of the liberation of the Mauthausen camp. And she said, I loved them, and I hugged the first one that I saw. And a very cute part is that among the students, there was one that was had darker skin color. And she said, and I love African Americans. She said, like you. And she said, are you, are you African, of African, descent? And the boy smiled shyly, and he said, no, I'm Serbian originally. So that was very touching, and for me, especially touching, because this is my mother, and I had not ever really, for a variety of reasons, tuned into her suffering. Well, the main reason is she always minimized it, like camp, like summer camp. Right, Faye?
It's amazing. My
it's
mother,
amazing.
Jonathan, this will astound you, because when you say, how can anybody make the Holocaust sound good? How can anybody do that? How can anybody make the Holocaust sound good? My mother, I guess she made it, I know it sounds horrible, but she made it sound good. She talked about laying, because in Mauthausen, there wasn't even enough room for them in the bunkers. So they had to sleep outside. So my mother would say, so we laid on the grass and we looked up at the sky and we saw the stars. Because I think for her, what she thought about was at least my family was together. She was together with her sisters. They all survived. It's a miracle. All 8 of them, 6 sisters, 2 brothers, all survived to build up families. So she was a person that would tell stories about the Holocaust, and I'm embarrassed to say this. We used to make a joke about it. We would say, Bobby is the only person that can tell a story about the Holocaust, and you almost wish you were there.
Here's an example. One year, I was a medical scientist, and one year I had a science meeting in Vienna. And before I went, at the time, I didn't go to Mauthausen. At the time, I wanted to visit the barracks in the school where my mother was a slave, laborer with her family. And I asked her, Mom, where were you? By the way, it's complete contrast to my father, who was a very broken Auschwitz and Buchenwald survivor. So, Mom, where were you? And she gave me an exact address. I was in whatever was 26 Admiral Street or something. And then she laughed. And I said, Mom, why are you laughing? She said, I can't tell you. Why can't you tell me? You'll think I'm crazy. And I said, Mom, please tell me why you're laughing. And she said, with her Hungarian accent, she said, I was just remembering that every day when they marched us from the barracks to the factory, we crossed the Donau River, and I remember how beautiful it was to see the sun rise over the Donau River, the Danube. And so I go to visit, 25 Admiral Street or whatever it was at the time, and I go by subway or the U in Vienna, and the train goes on a bridge, kind of like the Q train going over the Manhattan Bridge, over the Donau River. And it's afternoon and the train is crowded, and I'm seeing it's sunset time. I'm seeing the sun over the Donau River, and I'm just flooded with these feelings. And I'm looking around at all the Viennese natives who are commuting home from work or whatever. And I'm thinking to myself, if you had any idea of what's going on in my brain right now. So anyways, I learned she loved everybody, and and we had this horrible tour, which Faggy described. And then we went to the cemetery. So it is a memorial cemetery that, as Faggy described, is present on the grounds of Mauthausen. And the reason that it's there is that the Mauthausen itself became a national memorial area, and they needed a cemetery for it. And so my understanding is that they exhumed bodies from that typhus epidemic or whatever, and reburied them in this square of land. And we come in, and I see there are some Christians buried there too, without names. There's some crosses, a Star of David's, and then there is a matzeva, a standard, a Jew, as if you were in a cemetery. That is there with my grandfather, who I'd never met, of course. He died in May of 1945. I was born in July of 1948. And on the subjective side also, to share with you that when I was growing up as a little boy, that was all ancient history, happened a long time before me. Now I see how proximate it was. And an aspect that I think Faggy will confirm or clarify for me is that I'm recalling that when the family decided to do this, to have a matzeva, it was put up by the family, not the Austrian government, that they went to a Rebbe in Borough Park, I think it was the Chechenever Rebbe, and they said, how can we do this? Dad is buried in a not Jewish cemetery. And this touched me greatly, that the Rebbe, can imagine, he stroked his beard and he gave the answer. He said, your father will be in a one-person Jewish cemetery within this memorial field. And I saw this, I went to it with my family, and suddenly the matzeva became the grandfather I didn't know. I am feeling the same memory right now. I was overwhelmed by feelings and kneeled down, fell down, hugged this as if I were hugging my grandfather. And there was just such an amazing, to me, connection with somebody I had never known, who was dead. By the way, on another sphere in the left side of my brain, I'm a rationalist, life is life, it's material, when you're gone, you're gone. But on the right side of my brain or whatever, I was hugging my grandfather and asking him for forgiveness for not remembering appropriately. And very touching. And then, despite our not having a minyan, said Kaddish, sang Mizmor LeDavid, and said goodbye. And so that's the memory, Rabbi, that I share with you of that time. Oh, one more memory I just want to share with you. That we had a wonderful family bonding experience, myself and Faggy, at the time my brother Moish, and my mother. And the day after everyone left, I stayed because I had a scientific collaborator at the University of Vienna, another hematology researcher. She was the chair. Her name is Dr. Ingrid Pabinger. And I went to visit her to see her research area and all of that. And she knew why I had come to Vienna. And she said to me at the end of the science part of the meeting, she said, "Let me take you somewhere." Where's she going to take me? She took me down to the campus area of the University of Vienna and brought me to a corner of the campus where there's a statue of the Rambam, Maimonides. And there is a wall next to it with the names of all of the Jewish professors who had been fired, dismissed, the day after Kristallnacht. And there were thousands of Jewish students that were dismissed as well. And there was a plaque on under the statue of the Rambam of Maimonides. And it was a quote from the Talmud, which is, whoever saves one life, it's as if they saved the entire world. I thank Dr. Poppinger, and again, Faye, thank you so much for opening the door to that. And thank you, Rabbi, for the privilege of allowing me to share the story with you and all. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, Rabbi. And I want to echo something that my brother Jacob said earlier, which is I want to honor my sister Fagi because she took my two older brothers and arranged for them to go to Mauthausen and have an experience over there. She did the same thing for me and my little brother. And I got a call when I was in Israel a few years ago. Please come, get on a plane. I don't think I ever would have had, I know I would not have had that experience if it hadn't been for Fagi's initiative. And it was life-changing to be with my mother, to be with Fagi, to be with my little brother in Vienna, seeing where my mother, who had, as the story goes, gotten on the wrong train. It was one of those situations where in her small village of Bamazurbush, they were in line to get on a train to Auschwitz, and the Jews of the town knew what was going on, and they were scrambling. Which train do I get on? Which train do I avoid? And my grandfathers told the family, we'll just get on wherever they tell us, because it's, at least that way, that way, at least we won't get caught. I mean, we're doomed either way. But somehow, miraculously, they ended up in a labor camp in Vienna, were able to survive intact. And we took that trip, saw, like Yankel had said, the barracks where they had worked through those last few months of the war, and the camp in Mauthausen. I wanted just simply to relate that most of these stories that we're learning, none of us heard our parents talk about them when we were growing up. The general attitude in families was that the parents did not want to share the information. And I think we were often afraid to ask for the information. That changed in 1995 when Steven Spielberg launched the Shoah Foundation. And the idea of taking oral histories from people, from survivors, started to gain traction. When they came to this country, they were told not to bother sharing their stories. Everyone has their troubles. You're here, you're lucky. I wrote an article in 1995 for the Los Angeles Times about it and spoke with people who were doing the oral histories. And they shared with me how difficult it was to get any information from survivors. They were reluctant to talk. They intentionally scrambled their stories. It was very hard to process the information, but they persisted. And some of them were actually very aggressive in trying to get those stories. As somebody said previously, it's very important to know the stories and to tell the stories. So grateful, Rabbi, for having the opportunity to participate in this as well. The stories at this point never end. There's always a new insight. And as my father, always reminded us, Zachar al tishkach, remember, don't forget.
I think the reason that a lot of them did not tell their story was because they wanted to save us from the horribleness of it. But we would wake up in the middle of the night because you would hear them screaming anyway. And I'm sure it was very hard for Dina to hear all of these stories. And on the one hand, it's hard to hear them. And on the other hand, it's hard not to hear them.
Right.
I know a colleague of mine who, terrible story. He would come home if he didn't have an A on a test, if he didn't have 100 on a test, his mother would open the oven to 350, put her head inside the oven and say, I didn't survive for you not to get an A.
Oh my.
So yeah, second generation, we're there. We're paying our dues. But the fact that you're doing this and the fact that you're keeping this alive, Dina, I give you so much credit, because somebody who has lived through this and has so much pain, very often what they want to do is just put it away. You know, I don't want to think about it. So I give you a lot of credit. There's two more brothers. One of them is in Israel, and I just emailed him, but he's not answering. And another brother who's in the middle of working. He's a psychologist. My oldest brother is a doctor, Dr. Jacob. He's our idol. He's our guy.
I'll hear more about that later.
When he says, you know, if you save one life, you've saved the world. That's his life. That's his life. It's about saving the world. So tell them first what kind of doctor you are, and then I'll go next. And then Mr. Rand, you could tell them.
Well, I'm not restricted to a single discipline. So I'm an internist, a hematologist, a medical researcher, a pathologist, a laboratory director, professor, teacher, all that.
My brother is very humble. My brother is on faculty at Cornell Weill. He was head of hematology at Cornell Weill. Now he runs the Beekman Center at Cornell Weill. He's on faculty at Cornell Weill, Mount Sinai, Albert Einstein, works at Lenox Hill. He discovered something called the blood thing for women that have miscarriages that slides off. What is that called? That word, the P word.
Annexin.
He discovered for women that have many, many miscarriages. He discovered something in their blood.
But Faye, I have to stop you and just say that my greatest gift is I have a publicist named Dr. Faye.
And then my gorgeous brother here from Santa Monica is a writer. He's a journalist. Man, you want to tell them about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm currently a technologist. I work at UCLA and have done technology work in the entertainment industry for a long time, as well as being a writer. Thank you, Faye. Yes.
Yeah. Other brother, the other one is he was chief psychologist at Lutheran Medical Center, also a PhD.
I wanted to quote Elie Wiesel. I think once he said, if someone's still dying from cancer because we still don't know the way to fight cancer, because somebody who could solve this problem died in Auschwitz, died in Holocaust. So you see this a living memorial of this wonderful family, of this wonderful grandfather who is with you, Dr. Rand. He is with you. You're honoring him by saving lives. And your brother is honoring his memory by writing and by sharing his Jewish soul. And we're so honored that you are carrying the memory of your family into the future and sharing the light. Next time we go to Israel, let's do it together. And maybe let's stop Mauthausen and see this grave together. And let's take our students and young people to witness it. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to have you all tonight, and definitely want to get together and hear more stories and more inspiration.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
leaders.
much.
And thank you, family. So nice to see you.
Nice
Thank
to
you.
see you.
Bye-bye.
Love you. Bye-bye.